Today we are tearing into a document that operates on two distinct, really crucial levels. It's not just reporting on a terrible ongoing crisis. It's actually analyzing and strategically challenging the global response to that crisis. So we're taking a deep look at the insights from Forgotten Voices, Nigerian Christian persecution. Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is pretty laser-focused. We need to understand the strategic blueprint of this specific global awareness piece. I mean, if the crisis is so profound, why does the document spend so much effort discussing media failure? What's the source material telling us about how to, punch through all the noise and force a global spotlight onto a neglected tragedy?
Well, what's fascinating here, right away, is that the document's core insight is immediate. It's foundational. The purpose of Forgotten Voices, it seems less about just generating a fresh list of the specific horrific attacks, though that suffering is undeniably the root cause, of course.
Yeah.
It's much more about highlighting the devastating lack of international visibility those events get. So this means the primary campaign focus is actually addressing the global silence surrounding the events. It views that lack of attention as almost an extension of the suffering itself.
Right. Silence is a secondary harm.
Exactly. And this raises the central question that seems to drive the document. Why are these victims called the Forgotten Voices? And why does the source material argue the world must hear about it now? The material suggests the biggest obstacle to aid, to intervention, isn't just distance or, complexity. It's the failure of the world's attention filters, the global dissemination mechanisms.
That sets the stage perfectly.
Yeah.
The source material leads with this striking diagnosis, a core observation that informs the whole strategy that follows. These systematic attacks on Nigerian Christians receive little media coverage. It's framed as an attention deficit. But the document treats this deficit like a deliberate strategic problem, one that needs its own dedicated solution.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, you realize this isn't just a standard human rights report. It's an intentional intervention. It's designed to challenge the status quo of modern reporting.
An intervention.
Okay, think about the media landscape we're all living in. We're dealing with constant information overload and what researchers sometimes call compassion fatigue. Simply shouting louder about the suffering. Well, it often doesn't work anymore. The audience becomes sort of desensitized or just overwhelmed.
So the crisis is real, but the world's saturated. The campaign can't just rely on the sheer weight of the tragedy alone. The document seems to identify two stories here, is that right? The primary story of the victims and then the secondary story, the meta problem, which is the story of the media and the international community failing those victims.
Precisely.
And for you, the informed audience trying to grasp complex global issues, understanding this dual narrative is, well, essential. It's not just what happened, but why maybe we didn't hear about it properly.
Exactly. The document argues that by keeping the suffering off the front pages, the international systems, governments, aid organizations, even us, individual consumers of news, are effectively excused from having to respond. They can plead ignorance.
Plausible deniability through lack of coverage.
Right. The silence isn't presented as accidental, it's systemic. And that system, the document argues, must be exposed first.
Okay, if that's the diagnosis,
Yeah.
this massive systemic lack of coverage way, how does the document suggest they actually tackle that problem? Because the traditional approach, like you said, is often just flood the airwaves, with new shocking details, hoping the sheer horror breaks through.
Well, that leads directly to the surprising strategic maneuver detailed in the source material. Instead of relying on maybe a shock and awe campaign, which might burn out quickly because of that compassion fatigue we mentioned, the document suggests a highly self-aware approach. It's quite clever, actually. It intends to use existing news clips, headlines, social media reactions.
Existing stuff.
Yeah, but not primarily to report the story itself, but strategically to show the silence.
Wow, okay, that's fascinating. So you're weaponizing the accents of information. But I wonder, for someone just tuning in, maybe trying to catch up on a complex situation, does that risk diluting the immediate urgency of the suffering? Are they kind of fighting the media crisis at the expense of the humanitarian one?
That is the critical balance, isn't it? And the source material seems very aware of that risk. However, the strategy seems to operate under an assumption. The assumption that if they first address the why you haven't heard this story properly, then the audience will engage much more deeply with the what.
Okay, address the filter before the content?
Sort of. Think of it like an investigative reporter. They might focus not just on what was said in a press conference, but on who wasn't invited, or which crucial documents were conspicuously missing from the file.
Yeah.
The document implies a structure where the awareness piece might start with a powerful contrast. Imagine maybe a rapid-fire montage. Global headlines covering some less severe yet heavily reported event from somewhere else, maybe a political scandal, or a single natural disaster that got saturation coverage. That sequence would first establish the world's current level of media saturation.
Right, so that was the norm. And then
Yeah,
you juxtapose that saturation with the void regarding Nigeria.
exactly. The source suggests immediately following that montage with stark evidence of the lack of coverage for the Nigerian crisis. Maybe just a handful of short buried articles from less prominent sources, interspersed perhaps with 10 seconds of just pure graphical black screen, accompanied by an unnerving silence.
Wow.
This unique method turns the meager coverage or the lack of prominent headlines into the central exhibit. It becomes the evidence.
That makes the silence audible. You're demonstrably proving the neglect. By focusing on the gaps, the document avoids, perhaps, overwhelming the audience with more suffering, while simultaneously making the case that the victims were failed twice, first by the attackers and second by the global information system.
Correct.
And this is a crucial element for anyone like you listening, trying to gain knowledge quickly but thoroughly. You need to understand the structural impediments to that knowledge sometimes.
And that strategic choice, it aims to create a sense of immediate, maybe actionable indignation in the viewer. They're no longer just feeling sad about a distant crisis, hopefully. They might feel angry about the system that withheld the information from them.
Shifting the emotion.
Yes, it shifts the focus from passively receiving information to actively interrogating the sources they normally trust. And that transition from observer to challenger, that's really the heart of the campaign's mobilization effort. Which brings us naturally to the intended outcome. If we connect this strategy demonstrating the silence to the bigger picture, the entire framework seems built to mobilize the audience, to turn you from a passive listener into an essential active participant. The diagnosis of media failure effectively requires the audience to become the new distribution network.
So the knowledge isn't just interesting, it's presented as a call to duty. The document doesn't just inform, it details immediate actionable steps for the audience. It encourages viewers, once they understand the depth of the neglect, to share the information they just received, making that step almost mandatory because, the argument goes, the traditional channels failed.
Right, and it goes beyond just simple sharing, like hitting a button. The material explicitly calls on the audience to speak out for persecuted communities.
Yeah.
This isn't framed as some generalized plea for goodwill. It's a specific, pointed instruction. Use the knowledge you gain to fill the informational void, the same void that the awareness piece just documented.
That transition from knowledge to application feels very seamless and necessary in this strategy. And the document, it doesn't leave ambiguity about the final goal, does it? The source ends with a very specific, explicit call to prayer and advocacy. This linkage makes the advocacy component central. It feels mandatory. Knowledge here isn't just something to consume. It's positioned as the catalyst for action. Action designed to correct a structural failure. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? The document essentially requires you to become part of the solution, to amplify these forgotten voices.
Yeah.
You're positioned not just as a recipient of information, but as the mechanism by which the global silence is intended to be broken, kind of replacing the broken gears of the established media system in a way.
Ultimately, yes. The source material operates with this sophisticated dual focus. There's the undeniable crisis of persecution itself, that's the core, and then there's the accompanying crisis of awareness, of reporting surrounding it. The Forgotten Voices campaign seems to correctly identify the failure of attention as a primary obstacle, an obstacle to relief and change, and by forcing the audience to confront the silence directly, it tries to bypass that compassion fatigue we talked about and instill a sense of shared responsibility for breaking the systemic neglect.
That dual insight, I think that's the core takeaway we wanted to share today. The document defines advocacy not just as, speaking out for the victims, but specifically challenging the global information architecture, the media landscape aside, that allowed those voices to be forgotten in the first place. Which leaves us with a question, really. What responsibility does this strategy place on us, the consumers of global information, to actively seek out stories defined by their absence from the mainstream? And how do we ensure we don't become complicit in the silence ourselves? Something for you to consider as you navigate the news feeds and decide where to direct your attention this week.